Hey everyone, Pastor Keith here with another segment of Lite Bites where we are looking at a psalm a week to address the variety of emotions that we're experiencing in this pandemic. One of the emotions that is prevalent, and this isn't surprising, in the midst of this season is discontentment. And the reason that we find ourselves discontent is because a lot of things have been taken away, whether it be food or hobbies or travel. I'll give you an example with food. 2 nights ago, I got in the car and went to the gate gas station, filled the car up, and then went inside and bought a Milky Way and a Twix, a Milky Way for me and a Twix for my wife. I have not had a Milky Way since this pandemic hit. And I love Milky Way. And that's because our grocery runs have been very efficient and we're not getting the frilly stuff or whatever you call it. And so I got a Milky Way and it tasted great. There's nothing wrong, right, with food or hobbies or travel. But when they're taken away, like they have been in this stay at home, in this quarantine, and you find yourself discontent, it really reveals how quickly we can become addicted to something in the created world, ultimately for our contentment. And Psalm 136 addresses where contentment comes from. That ultimately contentment comes from God's steadfast love. And then it describes how or why God's steadfast love produces contentment. So verse 1, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. Give thanks to the God of gods, for his steadfast love endures forever. Give thanks to the Lord of lords, for his steadfast love endures forever. And then this phrase, his steadfast love endures forever, repeats throughout the rest of the psalm. And it's attached to a statement of what God does. So we see in verses 4 through 9 that God's steadfast love creates. Verses 4 through 9 describe the creative activity of God, how God created the world. Now, what does creation that comes out of God's steadfast love have to do with contentment? Well, let me address it in a few areas. First, in your view of self, the way you view yourself. If you're not resting in God's steadfast love that created you, then you will become discontent. Because you will look around you and you will see someone and say, I wish I were more funny like that person, or I wish I were more relational like that person, or I wish I were taller like him or her, or I wish I had this shaped nose like that person. God's creation, when you understand it comes out of his steadfast love, you understand he created you exactly how you are. He designed you uniquely how you are, right? You find great contentment in that. Let me apply it to marriage for a second. Now, this may be a shocking statement, but in every marriage, each spouse looks at the other and says, I wish my spouse were a little bit different in this area. Now, here's why I can say that, and it shouldn't be a shock, is because in our sin and selfishness, we think that the world would be a far better place if everyone were like us. And let me just say, can you imagine what the world would be like if everyone were like you? That would be a boring world, right? Or a marriage where both are exactly alike. No, God creates diversity. God makes us different wiring, different personalities, right? Collectively, we image God in our marriage. Collectively, we image God in our families. And so diversity or difference is not a problem. It actually is something to be celebrated as part of God's creative activity, right? And we find contentment in that. Let me apply it to children for a minute. Children are created in the image of God, not in your image. Right? Now, granted, they can get your genes, but ultimately they're created in the image of God. That explains why, if you have multiple children, you can have children that are very different. You can have one that's really a rule follower, and you have another that's the opposite of that. You have different personalities, and you wonder, how does that happen? Well, it happens because God creates children in his image. And therefore, right, you are called to raise your children, find out how they're wired, and raise them, right, to flourish in that, right? Not to raise them in your image, which can actually stifle a child, exacerbate a child, or exasperate a child. You're called to raise children, right, who have been created in the image of God. And so what we learn from that is that the difference among children is, again, a collective imaging of God. And so you find great contentment when you can just rest in that, right? So God's steadfast love creates, right? And that produces contentment when we're resting in him as creator. But second, God's steadfast love saves. We see this in verses 10 to 16 of Psalm 136. He describes how he saved Israel. He rescued them from Egypt. They crossed the Red Sea, which is all a picture of our salvation from sin. Now you say, what does salvation or God's saving have to do with contentment? Well, if you're not resting in God's steadfast love that saves sinners, then you will become extremely disappointed in people. People will disappoint you and fail you all the time, and you will allow that to grow bitterness in your heart and discontentment. Rather than realizing that everyone is sinful, including yourself, and God is a God of steadfast love that saves when we don't deserve it. It's a love that never gives up. And so when we grumble and complain and we sin, which we see in Israel's history, he continues to pursue them in love. When you can rest in God's steadfast love that saves, then you expect people to disappoint you. You expect people to fail you. You don't excuse it, but you expect it. And your contentment is tied not in somebody's perfect behavior towards you. Your contentment is tied in God's steadfast love that is saving them and saving you. So God's steadfast love creates, it saves, and then finally we see it provides. Verses 17 to 25 of Psalm 136 describe how God doesn't just save his people, but then he provides for them. They're wandering through the wilderness, and eventually he provides the promised land. That's their inheritance, right? And in the wilderness, he gives food to all flesh. We see that when he provides manna to his people in the wilderness. Remember, he didn't give them more than they needed. He wouldn't allow them to hoard, right, and stack and stockpile. He simply gave them what they needed every day. And what we learn from this is that contentment is not tied to how much you have, but it's tied to the one who has promised to never leave you or forsake you. I love Proverbs chapter 30, verse 8. It says, "Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is needful for me, lest I be full and deny you and say, 'Who is the Lord?' Or lest I be poor and steal and profane the name of my God." God's steadfast love, a love that never gives up, is what produces contentment. Because his steadfast love creates, saves, provides. We're all familiar with disclaimers, typically in the negative sense. A disclaimer is that tag that's usually attached to a product. And we see it in the negative, that it's just a company trying to prevent themselves from being sued, right? But the positive of a disclaimer is a statement that is meant to prevent an incorrect understanding of something. There's a positive disclaimer on every event of your life, every aspect of your life, every moment of your life, every reality of your life. And that positive disclaimer is created, saved, and provided for by the steadfast love of God expressed supremely in Jesus Christ.